Just like to begin the event by acknowledging the land from which we're all tuning in. And some of us may be coming from places along the Connecticut River Valley, which is where I am, from my home in what is called Conway, Massachusetts. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Nipmuc land. And I'd also like to acknowledge the neighboring indigenous nations, the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican and Mohawk to the west, and the Abenaki and Penacooks to the north. I'm Polly Byers, and I am the executive director of the Karuna Center for Peacebuilding, which is an NGO based in Amherst, Massachusetts. And for those of you who may not know, Karuna started over 25 years ago, focused on bridging divides in countries affected by violence, and has worked in over 40 countries by now, using a variety of different approaches to support dialogue, foster reconciliation, and build inclusive governance. And we're very pleased to welcome you to today's talk with Jennifer Lee, which is part of Karuna Center's series, Erasure and Restoration. And many of you may know by now, this is a lecture, workshop, and dialogue series that explores both the historical and current narratives around local Indigenous presence, as well as the ongoing settler mindset that has contributed to the threat and myth of erasure. And today we're really looking forward to having Jennifer share more about the history of the people of the Northeast Woodlands to better ground our understanding of the present. And just as a reminder, please keep yourselves muted throughout the event, but please feel free to pose any questions in the chat box. And we're going to look forward to addressing them during the question and answer at the end. Before I hand it over, I also just have to thank Mass Humanities and the Mass Cultural Council and the Ellis Phillips Foundation, without whom this series would not be possible. So briefly, to introduce Jennifer, Jennifer Lee is enrolled with the Northern Narragansetts, who are not yet state or federally recognized. The Northern Narragansetts are an unrecognized tribe, but can prove lineal descent. She grew up without knowledge of her Native ancestry and has spent her adult life learning the history and culture of the Indigenous people of the Northeast Woodlands. She's been giving presentations at schools, historic sites, and community events for over 26 years, and spends her free time with her grandchildren, gardening, berry picking, making bark baskets, and teaching bark basketry, and attending as many educational venues and powwows as possible. And with that, I am happy to turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Polly and Christina and everybody. This is quite an honor to share what I've been learning. My name's Jennifer Lee. I am on Mohican land. And just to get that straight, Mohican, Mahican are the same pronunciation of the Indigenous people of the Hudson River Valley, or the Connecticut River Valley. The Mohegans are a different tribe. They're in Connecticut. I want to acknowledge that people who are raised in their Indigenous culture, in their intact Native communities, have a very different experience than my experience, just finding out in my adult life. And I want to thank the families that have kept the culture and kept the traditions through the generations, passing them on generation to generation. I want to thank you for that. I also just want to thank people that have really helped me along the way, especially Troy Phillips, Marge Bruchak, Marlena Lopez, Mother Bear, Jim Peters, and my mom and dad. So I want to start with a concept that just 400 years ago, all this land, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, was all Indian land. Well populated, well used. There's a story from Sunderland, Mass, about a giant beaver. And this giant beaver kept making his pond bigger and bigger. And he was taking over the land that the fish and the animals and the people needed. And they tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't stop because he could make his pond bigger and bigger, so he continued. All the people got together and called on Habamak, an earth shaper, to try to talk to him, and he still wouldn't listen. So Habamak cracked him on the back of the neck with a big oak tree, and he settled into the land. And today you can see this beaver, the intersection of 116 and 47 in Sunderland. There's a mountain with a head just like a beaver swimming with his neck chopped. It's called Sugarloaf Mountain. But where I live is in between that and a mountain called Greylock. The indigenous people of the Connecticut River Valley, Abenaki, Sokoke, Pocumtuck, Nonotuck, Norwottuck, Waranoco, Agawam, Nipmuc, shared a vast homeland. Places where they would fish, hunt, plant, seasonal dwellings, ceremonial sites, burial grounds, medicine springs. They shared this land like that. They weren't as separate as today's tribes. The tribal names describe places, like the people that broke apart, like the Pocumtuck, the swift, shallow, sandy stream, or the Waranoco, the place where the salmon jump. These people were cousins, still are. They shared all this land, whether they used it individually or communally. They shared this ancient land for thousands and thousands of years, 12,000 years, 15,000 years, generation after generation. The descendants of these native people are still here. There's places along the Connecticut River where archaeologists have found 13 layers. They must have been really great campsites where people stopped at year after year. The town of Deerfield has only been called that for 350 years. Before that, it was Pocumtuck. The Pocumtuck people had a confederacy that went from Brattleboro, Vermont to Hartford, Connecticut. And also, people, the Narragansetts in Rhode Island, the Mohicans and Mohawks in New York, the Narragansetts of Rhode Island, all had interconnectedness with the Pocumtuck Confederacy for political reasons, for trade, for travel. And when you're traveling, remember there weren't motels and places to eat, so it's those fishing places that they shared. This land was so well populated by native people that those places where people gathered, at the treaty fishing places especially, were completely lit up at night. In fact, the whole coast of Connecticut and the whole coast of Long Island was completely lit up at night by people's campfires. Early travelers called these places resorts. Most of the roads we drive our cars on started out as Indian footpaths, traveled by thousands and thousands of years of moccasined foot travel. But they didn't always go in a straight line or the fastest way possible, because people traveled with families, babies, grandparents, so they didn't go near bogs or hills. They went where, after a day of travel, you'd come to a great campsite or a great fishing place. The Indian trails were well accommodated with villages, medicine springs, great places to fish, lakes, and bedrock mortars. Places where there were holes in the bedrock from using them for thousands of years, where you could grind your corn. Native people traded extensively as far away as the Great Lakes for copper and the Arctic Ocean for ramachurt. Ramachurt is the best for making arrowheads. Remember, arrowheads mean food. Native people communicated by runners. The runners were trained to run the distances between the villages and deliver communications. We communicated by calling hills, hilltops that you would call from one hilltop to the next, and then the next hilltop would call to the next. We also had signaling hills. Do you ever take a mirror and signal, see how far you can make that reflection, make a mark? We also have vibrating rocks, giant boulders that were balanced, that you could move and would scratch on the bedrock and make a sound that turned into a communication. The land was full of food because of the way Native people used the land. They actively managed the land. They burnt the undergrowth twice a year, which made the land park-like. They tended their deer meadows. They had nut groves, orchards. They sometimes made a fence in the shape of a V, a mile long, and drove the deer and wild turkey there for easier hunting. They also did this across the rivers. They made fishing weirs, like a basket 6 to 12 inches thick, made with sticks woven together and rocks that would be in a V, so that as a fish came, it would be easy to catch them there at the V. Some of the cornfields were 2,500 acres in size. There were so many birds, they sometimes blocked the sun. The fish in the brooks could be 2.5 pounds. There's enough wild strawberries that if you walked in a mile distance, you could fill three ships with the wild strawberries. They didn't dam the rivers because flooding in the spring is nature's way of fertilizing the soil. So every spring, those floods would bring minerals to the land. So cornfields were grown next to the rivers to take advantage of that. And the wigwams were up on hills. The clam beds on the coast were sometimes a mile long and so full of clams that you got showered as you walked over them by their squirting. Every spring, fish came up from the ocean. All New England was completely full of fish, including salmon. The fish came up in succession as the waters warmed in the spring. The smelt, alewife, shad, bass, salmon, sturgeon came one after the other in such a dependable magnitude that some said you could walk across the rivers on the backs of fish and never get your feet wet. When the shad bush makes those white flowers, it signals the time when the shad are running. So people would leave their corn growing in the fields and go to Peskiomscut or Turner's Falls to fish. The Weshwashkik Indians of Westchester County, New York, reported that a half day's journey was 18 miles in 6 hours. It would take maybe only a half a day to move a whole village from a summer to a winter camp, or a winter camp to a summer camp. Also, when the rivers froze, it became a really easy way to travel, dragging sleds on the rivers. The whole Northeast Woodland is a bark culture, whereas the Lakota people live by the bison or the buffalo. We live by bark. Bark makes our canoes, our wigwams, baby carriers, memory scrolls, harvesting containers, storage containers. Our longhouses in this area could be from 100 to 200 feet long. We also made dugout canoes, and Jonathan Perry still does. I think he's on his 15th. Some of these canoes were big enough to carry 20 people. There were some reports of canoes big enough to carry 60 to 80 people. We were big ocean seafarers. We could navigate the Arctic Ocean before any Europeans came here. The storage pits where we stored our supplies of food during the winter were dug into a sandy hillside, and they were sometimes 20 feet across, 12 feet deep, lined with clay that was fire hardened in place. That's a pretty big vase. Native people were astronomers and calendar keepers and made rock structures to help them with these activities. If you come across any of these rock structures, don't disturb them. We're still learning how they work and their importance. There are split rocks that line up from the Boston Harbor to Ohio that accurately denote the solstice. Native people had extensive knowledge of herbs from plants and trees for medicines. In fact, most of the medicines we use today are based on medicines already used by them. The corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, potatoes, sunflowers that we eat today are thanks to native farmers. Native people were taller, lived longer, had an absence of deformities in children, had great teeth, including Gladys Tantaquidgeon, the Mohegan medicine woman, who was born in 1899 and lived 106 years to 2005. Or Aquidamog, the Nipmuc man that carried corn to Boston. He carried about 80 pounds of corn to Boston when he was 28. He lived from 1602 to 1725, 123 years. There's a newspaper article about it. Also, this land, before Europeans came here, 1 in every 5 trees was an American chestnut tree. That's a lot of food. The trees were much bigger. Now I want to talk about some differing worldviews, just a very generalized comparison on the views of Native people and the views of the English at the time that they came here. So Massasoit was the great sachem of Massachusetts. The great sachem as in greatly loved. I heard one translation for his name is, he speaks our hearts. And this is what he said. What is this thing you call property? It cannot be the earth, for the land is our mother, nourishing all her children, beast, birds, fish, and all her people. The woods and streams are here for the use of everybody and belongs to everybody. How can one person say the land belongs only to them? One of the early traders in this area who took in beaver skins for other goods that were useful, said this: I trusted Umpachela on 1 red coat and 2 knives. If he doesn't pay me in beaver when he comes back from Squawkeag or Northfield, Mass, all his land is to be mine. So Native people had a large range of shared places. The Europeans had one fixed place with limited shared places. Native people were mobile farmers. They could plant their corn, leave it, and go fishing. The English were stationary farmers. To Native people, wild meant excellent hunting and also land full of spirit. To the English, wild meant unused and scary. To Native people have a relationship with the land, and they have a responsibility to the next 7 generations when they harvest. Sometimes the English thought, get all you can before somebody else does. Early deeds specifically reserved the right of Native people to hunt, fish, gather, set up wigwams, the way they always had. The English model of ownership was to alienate everybody else from that land. Here's some differences with women. Native women could be very important leaders, like Weetamoo and Awashunks. Leaders that were very loved and followed by many. Native women could have a career. They could own land. And if they were divorced, they weren't impoverished or banished. English women were not leaders. They could not own land. They could not have a career. They were subordinate to their husbands. And if they divorced, they were impoverished and banished. Native women were often the traders. They would make the trades. And they specifically asked for their wool and cotton in bright and lively colors. They also preferred French linen over English linen. English women did not work in that capacity. As far as leaders, Native people didn't have a centralized ruler. They had many leaders and many alliances. And a person lived with the leader they loved or left for another leader. The English were bound to a centralized ruler. Native leaders strove for consensus and reciprocity. The ceremony of exchange reinforces equality. European leaders strove for superiority, domination, and obedience. Native leaders distributed the goods that were given to them in tribute so that the poor were cared for. In Europe, the king was wealthy and the serfs were poor. Native warfare was to settle disputes, to scare their enemies, to count coup, which is the honor of touching your enemy. European warfare, the purpose was to annihilate, kill as many as you can, men, women, children, destroy homes and food supplies. Here's some differences in religion. To Native people, a different view, a different religion is not a threat. It could be an advantage. To the English, a different religious view was evil, threatening, punishable by death. And the papal edicts stated that Native people weren't really human because they weren't Christian. So they didn't have a soul, and that's why you could kill them and steal from them. Those papal edicts also stated that if land was unused, it was called terra nullius and you could appropriate it. But remember, unused land looked different to the English than to Native people. To Native people, you have a relationship with your creator that no one else can interfere with. To the English, they needed the priest to be the go-between. One of the Native ethics is that you do your very best to make your people proud. Another way of looking at it with the English would be that they would do their best to make themselves proud. Native people were free. European people were subjects. In the Native way, everybody is important. In the European way, there is a hierarchy of important people. The Native way of Thanksgiving is daily and seasonally so that abundance will continue. The Europeans had more set times for Thanksgiving. Native people don't proselytize. The Europeans thought it was their duty to change people to their way of thinking, even if by force, even if by breaking their own laws. Thou shalt not kill, steal, lie, covet thy neighbor's goods. The Native way, the focus is on we. The English way, the focus was on I. Native people have stories, sacred places, and wampum belts. English people have Bibles, church, and written documents. So as far as the colonial invasion, an elder told me once it was kind of like this. The guests were invited into the house and they took it over. And then they demanded the car keys and took over all the grocery stores. Okay, that's simplified, but one of the tragedies that Native people experienced was the diseases. They didn't have any resistance to the diseases that came with European travelers. From 1616 to 1619, 1/3 of the Native population of New England died. It's estimated that all told, 90% of the Native people died from diseases. Just think about that for a minute. We've just gone through Corona, but nothing like that. I mean, if 90% of your town or family or country died, everything you did would have to be done differently. It would totally upset your world. Some Europeans considered this to be a gift from God. To Native people, this was an apocalypse. Many settlers were helped by Native people giving gifts of corn, seed, and planting techniques. The Mayflower Travelers were 102 people. They died, half of them died the first winter. Of the 18 women who came, 13 of them died the first winter. There were sachems around that wanted to kill the rest of them because before they came, some European travelers murdered Indian people, kidnapped them, dug up their ancestors' graves, stole their winter food supplies. But Massasoit, the great sachem of Massachusetts, pitied them because they had women and children with them. So he made alliance of protection and shared land use with them. His son met a comet, or King Philip. By the time his son was an adult, those 52 people turned into 20,000. And soon after, 60,000 Puritans came here from England. They came with ideas from their leaders, from their religious leaders, that it was their right and duty to conquer Indian people and take their land. They brought cows and pigs with them. And the cows and pigs ate the acorns and the chestnuts that the deer and the wild turkey depended on. They ruined Indian cornfields. They ruined the clam beds. The Pocumtuck people of what we call Deerfield today were an agricultural people. They went to court and demanded that these settlers would keep their livestock and fences. Sometimes they were told to keep their cornfields and fences. The land deeds that were signed by Native people at this time were agreements of shared land use. They specifically noted that Native people had the right to fish, hunt, set up wigwams, gather nuts, collect firewood, as they always had. Native people had no representation, no legal representation at these land sales. Some parcels were sold over and over again without any clear borders. They were sold by people, by Native people who had no right or authority to do so. Often alcohol and exaggerated debts forced land signatures. In 1637, there was a war between the English and the Pequots, and the Narragansett and Mohegan nations sided with the English against the Pequots. The English set the village on fire while whole families slept. The Narragansett and Mohegans kept saying, "Enough, enough, stop." But they murdered 700 Pequot people. Anytime I heard this history, always got the impression that that was the end of the Pequot nation. And it's true that Pequots were forbidden to even say the name Pequot. But there were 26 Pequot sachems at the time, and a village might have 1 or 2 sachems. In 1659, the commissioners of Hartford sent word to the Pocumtuck people demanding that they attend their conference. The Pocumtuck sachem sent a word back saying, "We don't demand the English sachems come to our meetings," and that they resented the English interference in their tribal quarrels. In the 1660s, the Mohawks attacked the village of Pocumtuck, and the Pocumtucks left, planning to come back. But in the meantime, the English moved in. King Philip let the English know. He reminded them that when they were few and weak, the Wampanoags helped them and that the English should do as the Wampanoags did when the Wampanoags were too strong for the English. Likewise, the Mohicans reminded the Dutch that when they were few and weak, the Mohicans let them live in peace, and that the Mohicans want to stay in their own land. Metacomet, King Philip, related this to his people. Brothers, you see this vast country before us that the Creator gave to our fathers and us? That all our customs and council fires are disregarded. All our treaties made by our fathers and us are broken. All of us insulted, our brothers murdered before our eyes. Brothers, these people from the unknown world will cut down our groves, spoil our hunting grounds and planting lands, and drive us from the graves of our fathers and enslave our women and children. In 1675, Native people had forges at Mashantucket and Peskeonka in Connecticut and what's today Turner's Falls. They had everything they needed to make their own guns except the black powder, which comes from China. King Philip's War was an effort to gather all the Wabanaki tribes together, Wabanaki being the Dawnland people like New England, and drive the English back to the sea. At this time, there were more Native people than English, but many Native nations sided with the English, and many Native nations stayed out of the fight completely. Still, the settlers began to distrust all Native people on racial lines. The Nipmucs were forced to live in praying villages or reservations, and they were eventually deported to Deer Island without enough food, clothing, shelter, where many perished. Every year, the Nipmuc people go to Deer Island and commemorate their ancestors' struggle. 12,000 English houses were burnt. People died at twice the rate of death as the Civil War. Some English did go back to England, and the survivors became wards of the states, and English and Irish churches sent relief ships. Many Native people fled north and west to a safer place. By 1690, it was no longer possible to live from what the land provided for Native people. The Lakota out west could live another couple hundred years in their traditional ways to some extent. In 1704, the Huron, Mohawk, Abenaki, and French attacked the village of Deerfield. They included Pocumtucks who had wanted to go back to their homeland. In the 1700s, there were several dignitaries, Native dignitaries, that went to Europe with the purpose of understanding European law, asking that treaties be kept, asking for protection, and threatening violence if Europeans moved in to unceded land. Astanako, Arakulakula, Tawakoam were some of the Cherokee, Mohawk, Mohican dignitaries that went to Europe. In 1735 was the Deerfield Conference. This was a meeting called by Native people with the Massachusetts governor. 140 Native delegates arrived for the 5-day meeting. They included Mohicans, Mohawks, Housatonic Mohicans, Abenaki, Pocumtucks, Sokoke, Nonotucks, Pocumtucks. They met for the purpose of setting up a school, church, trading post at Stockbridge, Massachusetts, for Native people. In 1752, Ottawaneto and Ottaquando, Abenaki orators, spokespeople, relayed this to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Brothers, we tell you that we seek not war, and we want nothing better than to be quiet. And it depends, brothers, only on you English to have peace with us. We have not yet sold the lands we inhabit, and we wish to keep possession of them. We will not cede one single inch of the lands we inhabit beyond what has been formerly decided by our fathers. And we expressly forbid you to kill a single beaver or take a single stick of timber from the lands we inhabit. We acknowledge no other boundaries of yours than where your people have already built. And we will not any pretext whatsoever that you pass beyond them. The lands we inhabit have been given to us by the Master of Life. We acknowledge to hold only from him. The Mohicans had started the town of Stockbridge. They had a church, a school, they had a sawmill, they raised sheep, they spoke English, and they fought in the Revolutionary War on the side of the colonists, and they were still forced to leave their homeland because they owned the land in common. On one of their many removals in 1822, they were probably the first English-speaking people in Wisconsin. Electa Quinney was the first English school teacher in Wisconsin. In 1830, we had the Indian Removal Act. The purpose was that all Indian people had to live west of the Mississippi River. The Mohegans of Connecticut argued that they went to church and school and they were civilized, so they didn't have to move. But by 1838, things had changed drastically for the Cherokee people. The Cherokee people in Georgia, 90% of them were literate. They had their own newspaper. Only 10% of their neighboring white settlers could read and write. They had passed many laws to protect the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation wanted to remain separate from the United States and lands they had inhabited for thousands and thousands of years, the lands of their creation stories. Cherokee Chief John Ross collected a petition of 16,000 Cherokee citizens. They signed this petition on linen paper. The linen paper was sewn together, and if you stretched it out, it would go 160 feet. It was delivered to the United States Congress and ignored. So the United States sent 7,000 soldiers to make the Cherokee people leave their land. 12,000 Cherokee men, women, and children were forced out of their homes and forced to sleep in cattle pens, while their white neighbors moved right into their houses and stole whatever they couldn't carry on their backs. They were forced to walk 850 miles from Georgia to Oklahoma. 5,000 Cherokee people died on that Trail of Tears. Many people up north protested the action, but not enough to stop it. After 22 years after the ordeal, they had set up many new businesses in their new home. They had the best public school education for men, women, and children in the whole United States. They dressed like whites, but retained their culture and their clan system. And then the United States said they wanted more of their Oklahoma land. In 1866, Cherokee Chief John Ross died. Today, there are 380,000 Cherokee in the Western Cherokee Nation. And there are 16,000 in the Eastern Cherokee Nation in North Carolina. Those are descendants of the Cherokee people who resisted removal and hid out in the mountains. At this time, there were lots of Indian herbal doctors and doctresses, like Louis Watso and Molly Ockett of the northern countries. And sometimes genteel folk from the cities would travel 60 miles to get some of the healing from these herbal doctors and doctresses. Some of the survival strategies of Native people have been to adopt Christianity, reject Christianity, befriend the English, kill the English, hide in plain sight, refuge to a safer place, make and sell Indian brooms and baskets and sell them to the settlers for necessities like guns, bullets, wool, cotton, buttons. In 1849 was the gold rush. Many settlers had that fever to go out west and try to get rich. At that time, Indian people in California were shot on sight for being Indian. My neighbor, who's Mohawk, remembers that his father was very affected by that. Kind of put a dampening on claiming your Indian heritage. From 1860 to 1970, 100,000 Indian kids were forcibly removed from their homes and made to go to Indian boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice any of their culture. The purpose was to kill the Indian identity and make them be English. Many thousand kids died from malnutrition in these schools, from abuse. In 1970, the Native American Religious Freedom Act was passed. It is now legal for Native people to practice their spirituality after being underground for 350 years. In 1972, the Indian Education Act was passed. It is now legal for Indian kids to be taught in their indigenous language. Yet in 1976, the year my daughter was born, 9 Mashpee Wampanoag men were arrested, maced, and thrown in jail. Their crime? Singing Indian songs. Native American culture has been trivialized for centuries. Toys, food ads, mascots portray Native people as not really human, like the big tin Indian on the Mohawk Trail. And then there's the Hail to the Sunrise statue. That statue is pretty, but non-Native people put those plaques there appropriating the names of Native nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. And our United States Constitution is based on the Iroquois Confederacy. But an elder, a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois elder, told me that really what Native people gave to the people from Europe was the very idea of freedom. Native ceremonial sites have been demonized. They've been given the names associated with the Christian devil, and those names persist. At different times, here's some things that were outlawed. Saying your Native nation's name, speaking the Native language, singing Native songs, telling Native stories, having Native ceremonies or powwows or gatherings, even Indian baskets. As far as erasure, often when Native people died, they were called the last of their kind, even though they had descendants. What happened here was ethnic cleansing. It was a genocide. In 1990, the James Bay Dam separated many Cree people from their traditional lifestyle. In 1990, NAGPRA was passed. the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, addressing the disrespect and total ruin of Indian graves, and also the fact that Indian bones and skulls were being displayed in museums. 1990 was also the year of Oka. A town in Canada wanted to expand their golf course into a Mohawk burial ground. The Mohawks tried every single method they could to talk, petition, ask that their burial grounds not be turned into a golf course, to no avail. So it turned into an armed conflict. And for a month, the Mohawks shut down a commuter bridge. In 1997, Eloise Cabell, a Blackfeet lawyer, brought a class action suit against the United States. She and the tribe she represented had a documented theft of $47 billion. So the United States managed leases on Indian land for gas, oil, timber, agriculture, and appropriated the money, embezzled it, stole it. Some of the Native nations said that it was really more like $176 billion. So Eloise Cabell litigated this in court for 9 years. And she and the people she represented decided to settle. After 9 years, they were awarded $3 million. And one of the reasons was because the Native people who were owed the money were dying. And maybe they could have some help with some dental work or some glasses. But really what they were owed was a new house each. In 2002, astronaut John Harrington, a Chickasaw Nation citizen, brought with him into space the Chickasaw Nation flag, 7 eagle feathers, sweetgrass, and arrowheads. Is he a real Indian? 2007, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. 2018, the Catholic Church repudiates the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius and calls these ideas illegitimate and acknowledges that many Catholic people ignored the injustices. In 1994, 250 Indian languages were still spoken. In 2020, only 150 Indian languages are still spoken in the United States. Native women are missing and murdered at 10 times the national average. Crimes are usually committed by people outside the Native community, and there are issues of police and legal jurisdiction. Legislation is pending to address that. 2020, Kamala Harris introduced to Congress the Truth and Healing Commission on the Indian Boarding School Acts to document, address what happened in the Indian boarding schools. Today, Native people have 2% of the land in the United States. There are intertribal bison herds or buffalo herds. We have USET, United South and Eastern Tribes, a nonprofit intertribal organization to address the needs and situations of Native people today. And the National Congress of the American Indian, that was started in the 1940s. Anyone can join the National Congress of the American Indian and be a even if you're non-Native, and be a non-voting member. But this organization is a nonprofit intertribal organization to address Indian concerns. In the New York, New England area today, there are 20 federally and state recognized tribes. In the United States today, there are 573 federally recognized tribes. There's many more state recognized tribes and many more descendant groups like the one I belong to. I heard it told that what happened here was like a giant tidal wave that crashed on the East Coast and went all the way to the West Coast, losing steam as it went along. And as the tidal wave receded, people thought that there was no native life on the East Coast. But eventually the bubbles came up and people saw that there is Indian culture and people on the East. Native culture has most of the time, nothing to do with how you dress or how you look. I'll give you an example. I was visiting some friends on the Penobscot Reservation, and there was a family, a big family that lived in a little house and a little family that lived in a big house. And they decided to trade houses. Talk about decolonizing your mortgage. Another family moved out of their house for the weekend so that the parents of Dartmouth College students had a place to stay and watch their kids and their grandkids graduate college. They didn't know the people that were moving into their house for the weekend. So this is not a complete history at all, but it's just things that really stood out to me that I thought augmented the little that I knew from going to school. So I'm happy to take any questions, and thanks so much for listening to that.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. That was wonderful. And I mean, you've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate the way in which you did it as well, which was very much kind of weaving the history, but bringing it, to us in a very real and direct way. And it's also lovely to see you sitting there, as we all are, in your beautiful wigwam that you've made by your fire and feeding the fire. A lovely way to listen to you. So please feel free. We've got some questions here, people asking how they be in touch, etc. So we'll go through a couple of those. Maybe just one quickly here this is sort of directly on a point you made about the Catholic Church repudiating the doctrine of discovery. Renee here says that her understanding is that the doctrine of discovery has not been repudiated by the Catholic Church, even though the Vatican has been approached repeatedly. Do you have anything more to say about that or not?
I looked it up on my iPhone. Okay. And that's what my iPhone said.
Okay.
That's my source. I can't remember exactly where.
Yeah. All right.
I think it's Pope Francis that repudiated.
Okay.
Doctrine of discovery.
Okay. People are asking, or there's a question about what you mentioned near the end about an intertribal advocacy organization that non-natives can be part of. Can you repeat again what it is, and maybe, or how to direct people to follow up on that?
Well, it's a national organization, the National Congress of the American Indian.
Okay.
They meet several times a year. You can go to their meetings and you can join them.
Okay.
You just would be a non-voting, non-native member.
Okay.
Some of the other more local organizations, Native Land Conservancy.
Yeah. Okay. And we've put it in the chat box. It's been put in there for people, and we will have some of these resources on the website afterwards. David, looks like you are raising your hand, and I can ask you to unmute yourself if you would like to ask the question. Awesome. Well, okay. I saw a raised hand. I
did have a question. In a book on Virginia, early Virginia history around Jamestown, there were a lot of stories. They weren't Puritans. They came under contract with the English, whatever the the colony organization. So there were a lot of contract laborers. And when they landed in Jamestown, the conditions were so harsh. The stories were a lot of the contract workers escaped and ran off. That's why the book's called Maroon. They ran off to live with the indigenous people and were very happy and welcome there. The English leaders weren't so happy and they chased after them. My question is whether there's any of those stories in New England, or whether under the Puritans it was a totally different relationship between the people who settled and the locals.
Well, there were definitely people who were taken captive in New England that refused to be saved. They would hide out from the people that wanted to redeem them. They preferred to live with the native people. So there's that.
Jennifer, I'm going to give you another question for your comments or thoughts. A comment from somebody who says, it seems to me that apologies are meaningless without addressing actual resources and without reparations of the stolen wealth and lives. Are there examples that you would like to mention of either state or federal or other action of doing that, of trying to address in some way in terms of reparations? Are there examples or that you can point to or not?
Yes. In the 1990s, a branch of my family, the Crandalls, gave their land back to the Narragansett Nation. They said they were done using it and that the land was given to them to use. So they gave their land back. I mean, I think that people can give some land back, leave it in your will. I love what Okataw is doing. They've provided a space for Native people to get together and do cultural activities. There's something called real tax out west that sounds very interesting, where non-Native people give a voluntary tax to help Native people buy back land, their ceremonial sites especially, and then also help them put it into the system so that they didn't have to pay taxes. You know, Land Back, that's another organization. You know, it seems like it wouldn't be so hard to make that 2% be 4%.
Yeah, we heard a little bit about that, of examples in Maine of land, of working with land trust organizations, of repatriating land, some of the land that had been native land back to native tribes.
And the Native Land Conservancy, that's a really great organization. They get the land given to them. It's there for everybody, native and non-native, but it's not taxed. So it puts the land back into the way that it was originally. Native Land Conservancy.
Okay, and again, we can have references on our website after this to these organizations. There's a question about, could you say more about the Pecumtuck people and their relation with the Nipmuc, land, leadership, culture, etc.?
Well, that's something I try to glean a little bit. You know, Lisa Brooks, her books, The Common Pot, Our Beloved Kin, I think she really illuminates the history from a Native viewpoint, but also from the interconnectivity of it. I mean, sometimes all we have is the report about the Deerfield Conference. So just the fact that all those different tribes came to that conference together for that place in Stockbridge, I mean, that says a lot about being interconnected. But, you know, as far as, you know, more specifics, I feel like I've been trying to glean little bits here and there, you know, but especially because the place names usually describe the land. And so to the early English, they wanted to think about people being tribal and who's the leader so we know who to deal with. But it was really just the people, the Indian people are the people at Pecumtuck or the people at Warrenoko. But all the places that were shared really show an interconnectedness.
Okay. Here's another one for you. We've got another one, a couple. I am restoring a historic farm in Norfolk, Massachusetts with an 18th century house on it, the first colonist built house there having been destroyed during King Philip's War. I know there were obviously native folks using that land before, but I don't know a lot about them. Do you have suggestions on how to incorporate learning about them into the educational program we plan as we turn the farm into an educational facility for public school kids?
And where is it?
Norfolk, Massachusetts.
So tell me, I don't know Norfolk. What's it next to?
Neither do I.
I'm sorry, I was typing into the chat, but that was me. So yeah, we're near Gillette Stadium. It's about halfway between Boston and Providence.
Uh-huh. So the Mashpee Wampanoag, the Aquinnah Wampanoag are close enough to there. The Narragansett nations are there. So what I would recommend is learning about that history. And I mean, the first thing I think is to teach the history, and then to invite those tribal nations to the land. Maybe there's something that, you can provide to them. Have a great big dinner, invite people there. But you have to know the history to know the names of the places and what the native people closest to you, who they are and what they're doing, what their struggles are.
Stephen, did you want to add something? Thank you.
Thank you. I would suggest you investigate at the Medfield Historical Society. There's a lot of interest in their history, and indeed I lived in a house that was built in 1637 with my grandmother for a long time, and lots of arrowheads and so forth in the soil. I would suggest you look that they have a great knowledge of the first peoples. Medfield.
I'm going to try to get a couple of more questions in here. Here's one from William. I am Black. There are stories in my family that my great-great-grandmother was Native American, yet now no one knew from what nation. Because of anti-Native climate of the time, we cannot verify anything. How can our family find out more of information? And this would have been in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina area. So this is not around here, but in the South.
So I would highly recommend reading the book called Indivisible. It is one of the best reads about the Black and Indian connection. And I can tell you that if it's really important to you, you'll keep looking. Mm-hmm. I heard you can never run out of places to look. I mean, you got to start with the regular genealogy and look at every census record, every birth, marriage, death record. And then you find out what was happening political to the people in that area, to the Native people in that area, and find any records that they are listed on. It takes a long time. I just found out about an Abenaki girl that 17 years she was at it. I think I was at it about 20 years before I had a definite connection. As you can see, every effort was made to end indigeneity, to disassociate people from the land, to stop the culture. But if it's in your heart and it really matters, you will keep looking, and it's worth it. But Indivisible is a great book.
Great. And yes, and we will put that on the website. And William says, yes, our family has been at the search for 30 years. So they've been keeping at it, and I guess they will keep at it.
The other thing is a DNA test. I mean, a DNA test doesn't necessarily tell you a tribe, but it lets you know if you have Native heritage.
Yeah.
I know some people who have found their people that way.
Yeah. And Renee, somebody often also knows that often Native people were listed as Black and vice versa. So it's about reading, below the lines and looking at
Yes.
the bigger context. So bringing us back up to Massachusetts, on sort of, again, a broader question, but are there maybe your thoughts more broadly about truth and reconciliation efforts? Are there any in Massachusetts is in the question? Would that be a good idea? And I would ask you further of what thoughts you have about what that might look like. I know at a national level, there are efforts to start a commission on national truth and reconciliation, but it'd be to hear your thoughts about, related to Massachusetts, of what you think might be some good ideas or thoughts.
So after 30 years, we now have a commission to address the flag and seal, which are racist and inaccurate. So that's great. There is a website that's Massachusetts Legislative Agenda that deals with mascots, with the flag and seal, and there's probably some other things on there I can't think of. We also have a Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Western Massachusetts, Rhonda Anderson. So, and like I said, Okatow, I love Okatow. So that's what I can think of right now.
Okay.
And I want to go back to a previous question I keep trying to remember, and that is, when you're looking for your Native ancestors, what also can be helpful is what they did for a living.
Mm-hmm.
And a teacher named Thomas Doughton did a lot of work on this and found that, sometimes people didn't say they were Native in the documents, but maybe they were basket makers or broom makers or carvers or cordwainers. So what they did for a living could inform you about them. That can be a hint, a clue.
Okay, here's another one. I'm trying to find out more information. I think I live on land that was signed over by Umpachala, the red coat story you told. How can I learn more about the deed? And do you have ideas about restitution or repair?
Wonderful. So Hampshire County Book of Deeds has those early deeds in it. So you can read those deeds. See if Marge Bruchac wrote anything about it, because she is really foremost in this area. And as far as restitution, I think the desire to do something is really excellent, and you have to keep your eyes and ears open and not give up easy. A lot of people, they want to call a Native nation and get an answer right away, and it might take a while. It just might take a while. But there's an intertribal group in Springfield, Western Massachusetts Intertribal Group. I don't think that's the right name for them. But I think we're at a time where there's a lot of desire to do something, and it's Native people have to be the ones. I think it's best if Native people are the ones that create their program. That's why I like Okatow. First Nations Development Institute has been a favorite of mine for a long time, because what they do is fund Native-led business opportunities. And they're nationwide. They sometimes do things in the East.
Okay. You mentioned the Hail to the Sunrise movement. Are there monuments, are there monuments, statues, or emblems other than that you feel like here in Western Massachusetts, in our area, that perpetuate historical myths about Native people? Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Well, the giant tin Indian, I think, is in that category. Although my understanding is the owner of that shop did ask some tribal elders to come and help him decide what to do about it. But maybe it needs to be asked again. But remember, when you ask tribal elders, come out and look at this statue, there's traveling costs, there's hotel costs, there's food cost. So, sometimes people think, oh, I want to help Native people. And you have to think it through a little further. The Mohawk Trail mural that was on the Mohawk Trail trading post is being restored. And that's at Shelburne Historical Society. That is beautiful. That's a great representation of Pecumtuck life. The Hail to the Sunrise statue in itself is not bad, I guess. It's just that the history about it is put in the newspapers that it's wrong. And that appropriating of the Native nation's name is sort of irritating. And I know Native people who have gone to that statue and just wept, like, this makes us feel like we're not here. So it's a process. It's not a quick fix, but I think it's like the genealogy. If you really want to address this, you're going to find a way if you don't give up.
Yeah. Just for people who are, whether you're looking in the chat or not, there's a question about what is Okateo. Again, we've put in the link to it there, and some links are there, which we will include, will be on our website afterwards. So if people have questions, and there's a question, Jennifer, how to get in touch with you, and we can include that, on our website afterwards, whatever is the best way for people.
I love my landline. I'm still trying to deal with emails and texts.
Okay. Well, we will put whatever contact you prefer.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want me to tell you that now or later when you can put it in?
Yeah, we could do that later. Okay. All right. Well, I think we are about, I think we're pretty good here with the questions. So do you want to maybe close with potentially a song?
I would love to.
Okay.
This is a song about history written by Marge Bruchac, and I do have her permission to sing it, but I just love it. History, it was hidden away from me. Look, tell me, what do you see? Listen, I'll show you our history. 400 years ago today, the Europeans found their way into our land. Some wore the black robe and the cross, thought that we were children lost now at hand. They baptized us in holy name, and when the English soldiers came, we took the bullets, felt the pain of history. It was hidden away from me. Look, tell me, what do you see? Listen, I'll show you our history. Some came to trade, some came to sell, some came for what we could not tell, so let them be. English, Scottish, Irish, Dutch, French, and Swedish, they were such a company. We gave our daughters, lost our sons, drank their liquor, bought their guns, and wondered why we never run from history. It was hidden away from me. Look, tell me, what do you see? Listen, I'll show you our history. When Metacomet made his stand, some fled across the Mohawk land into the west. We held the river valley plains, and when the fleeing women came, we gave them rest. Pecumtuck and Pecasset ran to safety in the northern land, and when the fighting came too near, our villages would disappear from history. It was hidden away from me. Look, tell me, what do you see? Listen, I'll show you our history. They settled on our riverbanks. They drove us from our hunting lands, our planting grounds. The English then like locusts came, and when we found their villages, we'd burn them down. Hey-ya-hi-ya, we took them captive to the north. We took them in our families. Some chose to stay, they married in. Now they say our blood is mixed with history. It was hidden away from me. Look, tell me, what do you see? Listen, I'll show you our history. 100 years ago today, the native language slipped away beneath the skin. They called us darkies, called us French, safe to call us anything but Indian. My own grandfather changed his name. My mother learned to hide the shame. We grew up empty with no claim to history. It was hidden away from me. Look, tell me, what do you see? Listen, I'll show you our history. And now the drumbeat calls us in. We dance a circle round again, coming home. Our names are of a foreign sound, but our feet walk familiar ground, going home. The shame that sought to break our will finds we're not an easy kill. Strength to last 1,000 years, pride that's nourished by the tears of history has brought them back to me. Tell me now, do you see? I can remember our history.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was lovely. Thank you for your talk. Thank you for the song. And thank you for sharing your lovely wigwam that I think many of us would like to be in with you right now. But it was a wonderful, wonderful talk. Greatly appreciated. And as we've said, there are going to be links to the resources because there are a lot of questions that will be on our website. So just as a final word, if people are interested in becoming more involved, we do have working groups that are starting, and we have one on decolonizing curricula that's going to be starting this month, guided by Professor Ron Welburn and Jessica Dolan. And again, you can find out about that on the website. So for all of us, Jennifer, a huge thank you for your time, your work, and for the wonderful way you've given us the history today and your song. It was really lovely.
You're so welcome. And thanks to Ron and Sherry Welburn for your encouragement and for hooking me up with this.
We are all extremely grateful. So thank you all, and thank you all who were able to join us. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.